Third episode of GSD Talks. Very, very excited as we continue on the professional development leadership conversations with the GSD team. So, Tim, why don't you go ahead and give us a little update on what do we talk about on this episode?
3 weeks in a row. I'm glad we've been able to keep it going, and we've actually been able to keep it interesting. We've talked about coaching for performance. We've talked about thinking of yourself as a business person in security rather than a security professional. And this is really complementary to both because we're talking about conversational intelligence, how to be present, how to think about having quality conversations, and ultimately how to gain or how to create trust, which is the foundation of all good working relationships. And so I'm really excited that we had this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lisa, so what did you think about it and any key takeaways that you had?
So I think Tim really summed it up great. And you know, from working with Angela Scalpello, who's just amazing and has so many great stories and information and advice, particularly for young professionals and those who are really trying to build credibility and trust within their teams and to be credible advisors to the C-suite and other senior leaders. So for me, a lot of the takeaways were just, how do we build on different levels of conversation, which Angela talked about. How do we advance our position within the organization as a credible advisor? And really how, if we don't have access to coaches or mentors right away, how can we still take steps into, improving our conversational intelligence and our emotional intelligence to have more meaningful conversations?
A lot of really good information. I'm excited to hear it, and I'm sure the audience, when they do, they'll get a lot of takeaways. So thank you both for taking the time to introduce Angela to us, and I look forward to hearing it.
Back to GSD Talks episode 3. We have Angela Scalpello with us. Hi, Angela. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you. And I'm thrilled to be here. So I spent most of my life inside corporate America as the Chief Human Resources Officer and a trusted advisor and member to the senior executive team. And a number of years ago, I went out on my own, and I've been working with individuals, teams, and organizations to help them perform better than they even know they can. And I do that in terms of helping them understand how to show up as a leader and how to lead with emotional and conversational intelligence.
Thank you. So when Lisa turned me on to you as a possible guest, and we had our first phone call, it was kind of interesting because I was traveling, I was in my hotel, and we were talking. I said, what do you want to talk about? And she said, conversational intelligence. And as you were saying that, I was actually doing something else on my phone. I was like, there we go. Let's get into this conversation and really pay attention. So I know that historically for myself, conversations weren't innately a strong point for me. They were something I actually read books on. I had to focus on being a decent conversationalist. I don't know if I'm actually a good conversationalist. But in episode 1 of GSD Talks, we talked with Andy Scantlin on coaching and performance and feedback. In episode 2, we talked to Ron Warman about not thinking of yourself as a security professional, but as a business professional in the security industry. And both of those episodes hinged on the ability to have high impact conversations. So I think this is timely. And I thought I might open up with a story that I've experienced in the past, and it might give us a fun jumping off point. So several years ago, I was working on redeveloping some security programs. And we ran into a few issues where the things that we wanted to do with the technology weren't allowed by the company policies. And so I started reaching out to different people to talk to about getting an exception to policy, changing the policy. Why is the policy this way? What are we doing wrong? And so I was having trouble connecting with this one individual. He wanted to do everything over messaging. The problem for me was I was new to technology. I didn't actually know how to articulate what it was that I needed to get across to him. And so I called him. And when he answered the phone, he was like, my phone has never made this sound before. You can continue on message, click. And I was like, what? And so what was my next move? Well, I found out where his desk was, and I went over to his desk, and he wasn't there. And so I just kind of set up my shop at his desk and waited until he came back. And when he came back, he was like, oh, I'm sorry, you're at the wrong desk. I was like, oh, are you so-and-so? Hi, I'm Tim Wenzel, and I wanted to talk to you about this thing. And his face got blank, and he says, I don't like talking with people. And he had an anxiety about it, and he didn't like, he seemed to think that conversation was conflict in progress. And so I ended up explaining that I needed his help. I didn't actually know how to articulate the problem to him. And we actually had a really decent conversation, but he wasn't willing. And so with that perspective, Angela, do you see that in other places? Is that a common problem, to have anxiety about conversations?
First of all, I love that story. And I think a lot of people can relate to it. I think there are a number of us who used to call people now and text them instead. And I do think people have anxiety around conversations. And I just want us to think about something for a minute, which is, how do we conduct most of our lives? We spend most of our life in conversation. And so the ability to have a conversation that leads to trust and leads to co-creation of solutions is something that we all need to get better at. And there is so much lost when you don't have a conversation or when you don't have a good conversation. So I know these are challenging times because we're in a pandemic, and so much of the face-to-face has been taken from us currently. However, I think there's a reason why Zoom and platforms like that have done so well currently. And that's because people, like now, want to look at the person. They want to read their expression on their face. They want to create a connection. And you cannot do that through text or through email, because what happens is that there's implied tone and there's misunderstanding. And how many times have you had an email and you've stopped and thought, I think we're having an argument over email, and how did that happen, right? Because as I said, there's implied tone. And so I think the ability to have healthy conversations is really critical. And honestly, without getting political, even more important in these very challenging times.
I couldn't agree with you more. There's actually, I think it's actually a competency for anybody in management or leadership to realize when an email or a message thread has become unproductive, and to say, hey, I don't think I'm getting my, express interest across to you, or you're not hearing me the way I hope you're hearing me. So like, let's actually talk it out. So what advice do you give people on how to start having deliberate, healthy conversations?
First of all, there have been a number of articles recently, and both you and Lisa know this is a passion of mine, and that is that one of the skills we all need to acquire is the skill of listening to connect. Because many of us listen or think we listen, and what we're doing is we're listening to judge, like, oh, that wasn't such a smart thing Tim just said, or we're listening to reject, or we're listening to respond, right? And many of us, especially as we move up the ladder, feel that that's our job, to have an answer. And I would argue that in many instances, what our job is to listen and then have a question. And so listening to connect is probably one of the most generous things you can do for your employees, your partners, your family, your friends, because when we listen to connect, the other person opens up, and that's when a conversation really begins. And so the first thing I would urge us to do is to be present and to listen to connect, and to listen in a way that really is about, well, tell me more. Understanding not only why the person chose to share that with you, what the meaning is, and what the value system is that they're communicating by sharing what they're sharing and how they're sharing it. So the first way to start a healthy conversation is to make sure that you're really in a place to be able to listen. The other way to have a healthy conversation is to then ask questions for which you don't have answers. And what do I mean by that? So you and I and Lisa have talked about the fact that there are different levels of conversation that we all have. And a level 1 conversation is an ask and a tell conversation. And in many of our meetings, a leader comes in and says something like, we have an aggressive sales goal. This is what it is, and this is what you all need to do. That's a level 1 conversation. Now, if people push back, they might get into a level 2 conversation, which is what we call a positional conversation. I have a point of view, and I want to convince you that my point of view is the right point of view. And then you share your point of view. And the best outcome for a level 2 conversation is a win-win. However, let's be honest, in many organizations, what happens is that I dig in my heels and I hold on to my position. You dig in your heels, you hold on to your position. We work harder to convince each other that we have the right position. And we both display a behavior that we call addicted to being right. And when you're in that situation, you're not co-creating a solution. A level 3 conversation is when we're co-creating solutions. And we do that by listening to understand and connect, and by asking questions for which we don't have answers. And an example of that would be, what does success look like? How could we reach that sales goal? If we could do it, what would be the 1 or 2 things we'd need to do? What are you afraid of, right? What are our obstacles, right? They're questions for which I don't have an answer. I want to hear from other people. And a level 3 conversation is when we co-create solutions. A level 3 conversation is about an exchange of energy, right? And you don't get there unless you trust somebody. And again, when we go back to listening, right? A healthy conversation, there's ways that you include people, because the research shows that even greater than the need for security is the need to feel that we belong. And right now on this call, I could create a conversation that would make you feel like you didn't belong, right? I would use things that would exclude you. What were you thinking, Lisa? Tim, that would never work. Why would you even suggest that? No, we don't really know. Let's not even discuss that, right? And we filter things emotionally, right? So things come up through our primitive brain before we can access our executive brain. And if you have made me feel defensive, or if I don't belong, then I'm going to shut down. And if I shut down, I'm not going to trust. And if I shut down, I'm not going to share, right? And that's not the way to have a healthy conversation.
Wow, well said. We could just end the episode right there. Good job. Although you were right earlier on when you said that, Tim, that wasn't a very smart thing to say. That's often where I'm at, which is why I'm trying to focus on listening and saying less. But Lisa, she's on the call with us, and I haven't actually known Lisa very long, but she's one of the most approachable yet like competent, like powerful people that I know. And she was a big advocate for, this conversation. So Lisa, I was wondering what you might have to add on this.
Thanks so much, Tim. And that's very flattering of you to say. I don't know if I agree with it, but I appreciate that. I think listening to you and Angela talk about this and just thinking about this topic, I really appreciate how when I met Angela, I met her at an ASIS event in 2018. She was facilitating a leadership workshop. And I really appreciated the way that Angela used storytelling as part of her way to set the tone and build a sense of trust and just create a space where people felt comfortable. And then Angela and I stayed in touch after that workshop. And I remember our first conversation, she said, let's talk with the video on. And I said, okay. And I had to silence my phone. I had to close my email. I just had to try and really focus and be present. And Angela, you said that earlier about being present. And I think that's so important because I've had conversations with people about what it means to be a multitasker and whether that's really productive or effective. And I'm someone who really struggles, I think, to think critically and have very deep or strategic conversations while I'm multitasking. So that's a challenge for me. And I think, Angela, you've helped me really think about being present and listening and asking questions that don't bias the person I'm speaking with by giving too much away in what I'm thinking. So I've used that professionally and even in my personal life, just thinking about some of the volunteer roles that and in areas where I serve, and how important that is to really open up the conversation and understand what people's perspectives are and hear their real thoughts and build that trust and credibility.
Thanks, Lisa. You know, the other thing I want to point out is that the first time you and I met, we met in person, right? And we sat across from each other, and I learned about you as a person, right? And I often say at a workshop or when I'm working with teams, you know, I ask people for a show of hands, and I'll do it right now, you know, on this. You know, if everyone's listening, and I say to all of you who are listening, I want you to think about somebody you trust implicitly. Somebody that you can be vulnerable with, somebody that you can share honestly with, somebody that you can be who you are with any artifice. I want you to think of that person. And then I say to them, I guess you don't really know that person that well, right? And they, of course, they know, I know that person really well, and he or she knows me really well, right? Because it's person and relationship before task. Right? The people we trust the most are the people who know us. And so getting to know people at work, getting to know who they are, right, is important in creating that sense of trust, right? So that you can, and I'm not talking about oversharing, but just understanding who they are as individuals. And I honestly think during this pandemic that we've had that opportunity because, you know, you're on a Zoom call and somebody's kid walks behind the screen, right? Or the UPS person rings the doorbell, or, you know, something else happens, right? The smoke detector goes off because your kids are doing a science experiment that's gone awry. And it just made us all more human. And so I think that there's also that piece that we shouldn't overlook, that we have to know each other as people, right? And that as a leader, we sometimes become pace setters, and our conversations are around, you know, when are we going to hit the goal? What have you done? You know, how quickly are things happening? Where are we on this? And instead, you know, doing check-ins and understanding how we're all coming to this project and what our challenges are. And, you know, coming into a conversation, knowing each other means that we can have empathy and we can read each other and say, you know, you seem hesitant about this, Lisa, you know, are you concerned about something? Or Tim, you haven't spoken up in a while. You know, what is it that you're thinking? But I can't do that unless I know you well enough to read you.
I think that's such a good point, Angela. And one thing that just struck me as well, thinking about what Tim said, is that we don't know each other very well. We've actually never met in person, but over the last few months, he and I have connected. We've had video calls, we've had other chats, phone calls. And I think from my perspective, even in a short period of time, because we were able to connect in those meaningful ways and have just very open and honest conversations about the goals for getting security done and what we're hoping for to advance the industry, I think the level of trust really came through. I know about a week ago, I reached out to Tim with some ideas that I had that maybe I wouldn't be as comfortable presenting in a group. And I said, you know, can I run some ideas by you? And I didn't feel like he was going to judge me or make me feel badly about having these ideas. So I think even subconsciously, I was able to use some of those tips and the different levels of communication that you've been talking about, Angela, to try and build up that relationship, even though we haven't had that face-to-face, which I think, like you said, especially in today with the pandemic, that's really important to try and have those conversations, build that rapport, and earn that trust. So thanks, Tim.
Well, that is a really good point. We've never met in person. We've only really been talking over video conference or over the phone. And but there's a couple things that I think, and Angela can probably expound on these, that have made our connection, our relationship really productive. One, we've both come together on attacking the premise of how do we accelerate the advancement of the security industry? Not how do I become known, how do you become known, but how do we achieve this common goal? Also, I think you're just an excellent person. You're very approachable, and I try to be as approachable as possible, although I do talk too much. That's a thing that I have. But when you can enter into a relationship where you want to develop trust and you want that working relationship because you both believe in the goal, that's the ideal situation. But often we don't find ourselves in that situation to where everybody wants the same thing. In fact, a lot of times we build up anxieties before critical conversations or even before project conversations because we really want our outcome, or we really need it to go this way. We're really afraid of the way this person always pushes the projects, and it makes it so hard. So how do we design for good outcomes when we know we're going into a conversation where we are kind of amped up and feeling defensive already, Angela?
So the first thing I want to just set the context is that many times we go up the ladder of conclusions, right? And so, for example, I'll give you an example from a client of mine. He was having issues with his boss, and we were working on how to have a better conversation with his boss. And so I'll change some of the circumstances to protect the innocent. And so basically I said to him, so tell me about what you want to achieve and tell me what your concerns are. And he said, well, I want to talk to him about changing my role somewhat, but I know that he's going to want me to keep doing what I'm doing because I'm really good at it, and because he's going to be afraid that Brian is going to feel that I'm encroaching on his territory, so he's not going to go for it. And I said, wow. I said, this is really interesting. I said, how do you know this? I said, did you hear this from somebody? Did he tell you already? And he said, no. And I said, well, then how do you know this? So I share the data, I said to him. And in essence, without going into all the unpicking we did, he had gone up the ladder of conclusions based on other conversations he'd had. And so in essence, he would have gone into that conversation primed for an outcome that he probably would have gotten. Instead, I said to him, why don't we rethink and reframe how you might have that conversation, right? And so the conversation went very differently, and this is how it went. He went in, he asked for time with his boss, and he owned where he was in the conversation. And he said, in the past, you and I have had conversations about me wanting to expand my responsibilities, and I'd like us to think about having a different kind of conversation. And I want to own where I am. Where I am is that I want to talk to you about how I can add greater value to the organization. Here are some of my ideas. I'd love to hear what your ideas are, right? And this goes back to the conversation that you and Brittany had with Andy Scantlin, right? Which is making it about we, not about I, right? And then when his boss said to him, I'm concerned because I think Brian might feel that you're trying to take over some of what he does, for him to respond and to say, could we talk to Brian about it? Or what do you think Brian's concerns are? And what are your ideas about how we might alleviate those concerns, right? Or when his boss said to him, well, do you think that this will make people feel that this is a promotion? Because I can't give you a promotion right now. He asked him a question, which is, why would that be important to other people? Not to see this or not to see this as a promotion. They were all questions to explore co-creating a solution, right? So that's one way to do it, is to make sure you're not going up the ladder of conclusions, right? The other thing too is our brain, right? Our hippocampus stores all our memories. So we've also got to think to ourselves, you know what, the last time I had a conversation with Lisa, she was sort of snappish, right? We have to let go of that. That was a moment in time, right? To approach a conversation as a fresh beginning, and for us to be able to, again, say to Lisa, you know what, I want to have this conversation with you. I know the last time we talked about it, you seemed distracted. Is this a good time to have the conversation, right? Also in a meeting to say, you know what, if you feel that things are elevating in a way that's not going in a productive way, to sort of take a time out and to say, you know what are we all trying to achieve here? Right? Again, what are we trying to achieve here? What does success look like? Right? What if we could start with a clean slate?
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with you. And not to kind of hijack the topic, but you mentioned, not going up that ladder of conclusions. So Andy Scantlin, we did the first episode. He and I are launching a series of articles called Vanquishing Evil Management. And not to give a plug for that, but the article that we're releasing next week right after this, the concluding line is, and it goes perfectly, I think, with what you said, is the evil is often in our assumptions and biases that we believe are true, but lack the courage to address and resolve. These conversations, if thoughtfully done, are not as intimidating as they seem, yet they set the foundation for a productive relationship. I think that's true. And I guess we could probably solve the world's problems. We could just stop all the MBA classes right now and just say leadership equals vulnerability. Done. Because I know in not too long, I'm going to have to resume a conversation that started pre-COVID to where I was absolutely right and I'm amazing. But now I'm going to have to say, hey, so circumstances have changed. How is everything going? Let's not pick up on that conversation, which was less than productive. And I was definitely a contributor to that, unfortunately. But we all get there, and being able to admit, even if the other guy's obviously more wrong than I, but I had a part in it. And so if I own that and I open up to being vulnerable, hopefully they will reciprocate, and often they will, because you're satisfying their grievance as well, right? You're acknowledging that they probably feel the same way about the conversation as you feel about it, that they were right and you were unreasonable. And that takes a lot of courage, especially in the security industry where we tend to be a bunch of type A's. We tend to come from that very regimented military law enforcement background to where leading, being a manager, being a director, means being right and telling people what the right thing to do is. And I'm going to hand this off. Right after a quick illustration to Lisa. But I had an illustration. I guess I don't have an illustration anymore. But how do we refocus? Whether it's a conversation that we kind of helped ruin, and how do we refocus that back on a healthy topic, or how do we allow ourselves to be vulnerable as leaders to lead productive conversations with the people under us? Lisa, what are your thoughts?
Tim, I think those are really great points, and you hit on a lot of the thoughts that I had too about, I think when you're vulnerable, you're not only developing that trust and credibility that Angela mentioned earlier. I do agree with you that it takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong or you don't know the answer to something. So I think that if you can have that authenticity and honesty with yourself, then that will, and you approach conversations with that in mind, and you encourage others to model that, I think you can build that trust and it grows over time. So that becomes more part of the culture or the relationship that and reputation that you have for having those types of conversations and being that kind of leader at the organization where people do trust coming to you and having those discussions. And then, like Angela said earlier, just that you're part of building a solution that's lasting as well. I mean, you can develop an idea or a solution, but if you don't have the buy-in and the credibility when you bring that to the C-suite or senior leaders, then a lot of your work may either be pushed off or not approved. You might have a long way to go. So I just feel like if you're modeling some of those really great ways to approach conversations, the way you've been talking about and the way Angela's been talking about, then that really does build your reputation and your credibility within the organization and your ability to get things done.
And one thing I want to focus in on is that the importance of that level 3 conversation that Angela was talking about. When we were kind of having our pre-conversation, she mentioned a very interesting fact that leading a really meaningful trust-based conversation that actually gets things done is more about listening well and asking pertinent questions so that the other people feel heard, they know they've been heard, and their ideas have been weighed, appropriately. So Angela, how do we actually listen well and ask questions that draw out other people's genius, right? Make them feel important and heard, but also inject our insecurities and the things we're worried about in the form of a question.
I want to take your question, Tim, and I want to take Lisa's comment about getting people to get behind your ideas or to buy in or at least support part of your agenda. So that to me is about having the kinds of conversations that open up space for real sharing and real collaboration. So let's make up an example, okay? You have something that you want to sell, so to speak, at Facebook. And Lisa, you have something you want to sell at your organization, right? You believe in it. And to me, that's being a good political navigator. And I believe that politics in the workplace is a real thing, and it's not a toxic thing. It means that you have an agenda and a platform, and you need to get people to support that platform in its pure sense. So you can either go through the organization and try and strong arm people and argue and either be in a level 1 conversation, which is that, just tell people this is what you're going to do, or you can be in a level 2 and you can try and persuade people as strongly as you can, or you could go to somebody who you need their buy-in, right? You need their support. And you can say to them, here's something that I think would be good for the organization. And here's all the reasons why. What do you think of it? And they might say, you know what, I'm not comfortable because you know what, the issue about politics in an organization is that we compete for limited resources. And they might say, well, you know what, I have this project that I'm trying to do. And then the question becomes, okay, so if you could support what I'm trying to do, what would it take for you to do so, right? In essence, it's a question for which you don't have an answer. Or if someone says to you, you know what, I'm really not comfortable with that. We tried that once before. We didn't get a lot of support from product. You know what, then to say, okay, what would you need to see to be more comfortable with that? And I have never in my career found that a question that says, what do you need to be more comfortable doesn't elicit some sort of proactive move ahead step, right? And I'll give you an example from some work I did with a company in Central America as part of a work I do for a not-for-profit. It was a classic finance product conflict, right? Product wanted more money from finance for their product launch, and finance was digging their heels in, and product was saying things that you've probably heard, which is, well, how are we supposed to grow this company if you won't invest in the product stuff that we need, right? Excuse me. And finance was saying, you know what? You have misspent money in the past. You've gone over budget. I can't trust you to do this. It was back and forth, and it was going nowhere. And I said to them, okay, why don't you, product, first of all, own the reality, own what you have to own based on past behavior and say, okay, I hear you. We've gone over budget in the past. This is what we need to do now. Here's the reason why we need to do it. This is the money that we need. What would you need from us to feel more comfortable funding this product launch? Okay, that was an open invitation. The finance team said, well, you know what? We didn't know because you weren't giving us updates. We didn't know until 6 months that you were that much over budget. Okay, so what would you want to see this time around? I'd want to see monthly updates on where you were in terms of spending against budget. Okay, we can do that. And then the genius was not to stop there and say, what else do you need from us to be comfortable, right? We'd want to see your plan in advance and your contingency plans in case the budget started to slip. Okay, we can do that. So if we do monthly budget updates, right? Cost against budget every month. If we showed you the plan in advance in terms of where our fixed costs were, where our variable costs were, would you be comfortable funding us? Yes. It was owning where they were and asking questions. What would make you more comfortable, right? If we could agree on a solution, what would you need in order to do that?
I think that's such an important point because as English speakers, we look at interrogatives as, well, what is the problem that you see with this? Or why do you feel that way? Or why won't you get on board? And those questions are fine, except for they put the person on the defensive. We're basically saying, well, what's the problem with you? Because I think this is fine. And the way you're talking about framing it is actually meeting their hierarchy of needs. They have insecurities. They may have insecurities. They may not. They may have, other ideas. They may have reasons why your idea won't work. But instead of just saying, well, what's wrong with my plan? And now you're creating conflict. You're asking them, well, what would you need to be able to support this? Or the last time we tried something like this, what were the problems that we came across? And like, how do you think we could preempt them? And these are engaging, and you're tapping into their ideas and their IQ. I think it's brilliant. That's awesome.
So I want to also share something with you that I think we can all appreciate. So I was asked to come in and work with a team that had been experiencing some conflict, and they had just had some new people integrated into the team. And so they had all worked together though, right? So even though it was some new members of the team, they all knew of each other, worked together. There were some new hires though, so keep that in mind. So what did I tell you? There were conflicts. There were some obstacles on this team. There were some hurt feelings. There was some, it's always high school, right? Tim doesn't talk to this person, so I'm friends with Tim, so I'm not going to talk to that person. So I come in and I say to them, I have whiteboards all over and flip charts. I want you all to, and I had the names of all the members of the team, right? So Lisa's name was up there, Tim's name was up there, Lee's name was up there. I want you to write something that you appreciate about that person or that you look to that person for. And for the new employees, since we were all sort of involved as to why those positions had become open and were filled, what are we hoping those people will bring to the team? So people started writing things. I looked to Lisa for her common sense. I looked to Tim for his willingness to look at other solutions. I look at Lee for his technical abilities. And so literally, when Lee walked up there, or when you walked up there, Tim, or when you walked up there, Lisa, you saw all these things that people thought about you. And we called it a gallery walk. So before the meeting started, everybody did this gallery walk. And then we started the session. And I said, how do you all feel about that? And people felt really good because in many instances, people saw things about themselves that they either thought people didn't notice or they didn't realize that they had an impact. So I said to them, as we talked about conversational intelligence later on in the workshop, how did you all feel at the beginning of this workshop? And they said, I felt really positive. I felt really warm. I felt really connected with my colleagues. Now remember, what did I say? This was a team filled with conflict. And I said, okay, that was deliberate. That was a lesson in increasing your levels of oxytocin, right? The feeling good hormone. I could have started this workshop by saying, I know there's a lot of conflict on this team. You really had a lot of arguments. You don't see eye to eye. I'd like you to write everything up there that really pisses you off about each other and really annoys you. And even telling them that, I could feel the energy in the room drop. People start to withdraw and feel defensive. But how many times do we go into what we would call in the events industry, a wash-up call, or, a post, event cleanup, and people say, you know what, that did not meet our expectations. What did we do wrong? You know what, Tim, what happened with the logistics, situation? What happened with the supply chain? Why didn't we do this? Right? And does anybody then feel able to be vulnerable and say, you know what, I should have started this sooner. That's what I learned, right? And so again, we have so many tools within our own control to set the tone and the conversation to get a very different outcome. And there are many companies that we could talk about right now that have had significant problems, right? Boeing is one of them, right? Because people did not want to speak up. And why? Because it was communicated that it was not a safe place to say, you know what, we've got to put safety before money, right? Any number of companies where we've seen people not lead, it's because they've created a culture where the conversations do not open up conversations, but they shut things down.
Lisa, in your role, how do you encourage that environment of openness and security within security, so that you can have honest conversations, especially with people that report to you?
So thanks, Tim, for the question. I think that I really try to be very intentional about acknowledging any challenges that might exist up front. So if there's a safety and security consideration that might not necessarily be on the same page as a specific event or activity that's business critical, acknowledging it up front and saying, okay, well, I know this is important to you. I know this is a priority, and let's see if we can talk this through and find a way forward. Because I think in talking with other security professionals too, sometimes we have the reputation for just saying no, or not being open-minded enough to talk through and really understand the business, understand the critical activities and events that still need to take place and to have our work get done. So especially in the nonprofit sector, this is very important. And I hope that people have found me approachable and open to hearing their perspective, as well as solutions that might fall outside of what I might be traditionally used to or just thinking about. So trying to remain open-minded about that and have very, transparent discussions about the different risks and options has been something that I've been applying in this job and then at other places where I've worked as well.
It's so important, and it's a two-edged sword. When you want to solicit other people's opinions, when you want to maintain that openness, when you want to be vulnerable, but you want to hear what's on people's minds, sometimes what comes out is not what you expect, or would like to come out, right? I mean, I'm beautiful in the mirror, not really, I'm kind of always ugly, but the things that we do, we take our intentions into account, right? So everything is much more clearer to ourselves. But then sometimes we hear from others different things. What tactics have you taken to deal with those things, Lisa?
So I think that it goes back to some of the things I've learned from working with Angela and trying to be more mindful about how I'm entering conversations and how I'm presenting my point of view. If something comes back and it wasn't intended, I think this goes to the points about have you built up enough credibility? Have you built up your reputation strong enough to not be seen as coming to the table with a solution or a proposal or a recommendation that's perceived in a way that might be negative or not what you intended? And if people do read it that way, then they hopefully will feel like they can approach you or ask for clarification. And that is an honest conversation that can happen and then be productive in moving forward.
To build on what Lisa just said, I think, first of all, I know from having spoken with Lisa about some of her situations that she is that kind of a leader. I think part of what Lisa does well also is to really live what understanding means. And so I'm going to use a prop. This is not a product placement. We're not sponsored by Starbucks, as far as I know. But when I do workshops, sometimes I'll hold up something like this. So can you see that? And I say to people, what do you see? And they tell me what they see. And I say, interestingly enough, though, the people who are sitting behind me see this. And understanding means taking the time to stand under somebody else's perception of reality. So when somebody disagrees with you, instead of taking it as a challenge, to say, help me understand that. Doesn't mean you have to agree ultimately. I do feel that you have to show them the respect to say, help me understand that, right? Why is that important to you, right? What do you think the impact would be, right? Because if we really believe in genuine diversity, cognitive diversity, experiential diversity, if you always have the right opinion and the right way of doing things, what's the point of community and diversity and teams unless you really are willing to stand under somebody else's view of reality, right? And to be open to what that might look like and what you might learn from it.
Yeah, and if we were all the same, we all had the same opinions, life would be really boring, and the workplace would be seriously boring. So nobody really wants that. So to close out, I had one last thought that maybe Angela could share with us on. It's a big deal in security to get in front of executives, get in front of C-suite, and to present well and speak well. So do you have some quick tips for how to design your conversation, design a presentation for the C-suite?
So that's a biggie. So when I was coming up in the executive ranks, I had to overcome, I'm not saying that I'm Jennifer Lopez, okay, so let's be very clear about that. But because I grew up in a very working class neighborhood, right, first generation college, I always felt like I was Angela from the block. And did I really have the credibility, right, to be part of that executive C-suite? And so I think the first thing in presenting to the senior leadership team is to understand what's important to them. Right? So I used to always say to people, CEOs want to know what other CEOs are doing, right? People in your executive team want to know what other businesses are doing, right? So making sure you know who they are as individuals and making sure you understand that you're going in there to solve a problem that will lead to the success of the business, right? Going in there and not being territorial, going in there and thinking from a we perspective, right? I also sometimes go into a meeting and before the meeting, so in essence, in preparation for the meeting, ask people a couple of questions. At the end of this meeting, you will be able to finish this sentence how? This was a good use of my time and energy because we accomplished this or we learned this or we're able now to do this. Right? So to understand that it's not about what you want to tell them, it's about what they need to hear to make the kinds of decisions that they need to make. And then to be brave enough to ask the question that one is always afraid to ask, which is, what do you think about what I just told you? How do you feel about what I just shared? Because you really want to know it in that moment when you can still have a conversation about it. Right? So if they say, well, you know what, I think that's a risky strategy. Okay, can we double click on risk? What does risk mean to us as a senior leadership team? And can we talk about what our levels of risk tolerance are, right? So to make sure that it's about what they want to hear, not what you want to tell them, to, in essence, do some pre-work and understand what they're hoping that they'll be able to accomplish after you share what you've been asked to share. And then to also make sure that you've got the trusting relationships with people on the team who can give you honest feedback, who can say something to you like this. You know what, Tim? I know that you want to be seen as a strategic leader by the senior leadership here. I want you to know, though, that when you rush to solution, when someone asks you a question, it doesn't present you in that light, right? So someone being able to give you honest feedback because you trust them and they trust you, to take it as a learning opportunity and not to take it personally.
That earlier, when you were telling one of your stories, it just made me reflect on also by trying to practice and grow our skill set in this area, it has done a lot for me personally as well as professionally to develop. I wanted to share that your advice and counsel really helped me build my confidence in areas that maybe I didn't think I was capable of before. So for example, I know you helped me navigate a career transition, and you encouraged me to try and get out and put more of my voice into conversations or things like that. And I'm reflecting on 2 years ago, if you told me we were going to record a conversation that would be shared with more than one person, I would have been very nervous. I'm still nervous about it, but I'm trying to grow in this area and practice more. So I'm just thinking, though, not everyone, especially our young professionals, has access to someone like you or a coach or a mentor. So do you have advice that you can offer that they can help work on some of these skills that to improve their own conversational intelligence?
I'm happy to share book resources. I'm happy to share YouTube resources. You know, I love the security industry, as Lisa knows. I think I should be the CSO of Salesforce, Tim. I saw that job posting, Senior VP. And I also feel very passionately about getting women moving up in the ranks. So more than happy to facilitate a conversation if you put some people together. And I think there's a lot of resources out there. I also think that it's really important that, I think I might have said this to you all, that we all get cabs. And I'm not suggesting that you get a medallion taxi. What I am suggesting is that you get a KAB, which is a kick-ass buddy. And that is somebody who will say to you, you know what, Tim, I thought you were making a commitment to get out there more and to network, right? Or, you know what, somebody who believes in you and reminds you, right? And holds your hope and your confidence those times when you've lost them for whatever reason. And I know one of the things I would say to Lisa from time to time is, you know what, you have options. Or I'd say to you, you know how to ask a question, right? Right? It's not about negotiating or pushing back or whatever it is that somebody might feel uncomfortable doing. It's about saying, you know, what's your flexibility in terms of that salary? Or I'd like to talk about a higher number, right? It doesn't have to be confrontation, right? I think that's what sometimes stops people from having conversations, because we go up the ladder of conclusions and we already know the person's going to get angry and they're going to get defensive. And we don't know that. And it often doesn't happen. So thank you, Lisa. Getting to know you and work with you has been a genuine gift.
Thank you, Angela. It's been so impactful for me to know you and to hear your advice. So thank you. And thank you, Tim, for facilitating this discussion today, and Lee. It's been a great afternoon.
Thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it.